Welcome to another episode of Peanuts from the Plebs,
Hello,
the
everyone.
pre-election edition. And we're not going to make any predictions, I don't think, because
we already made predictions.
We already made predictions, and if we make any predictions, it's going to be, it's probably not a good idea because hopefully within a few days we will know.
But most likely we're still going to make predictions.
Well, we'll still make predictions.
I have no idea. Who knows what's going to happen?
I don't think we're going to spend the whole time talking about the election. We're going to talk about other stuff, right?
Right. Well, I don't know that we're going to talk about the election at all this time, right? That we already did that.
Okay. So where do we start?
So you wanted to talk about, give us a little lesson on populism, right?
Yeah, well, I'll paraphrase some of Thomas Frank, who's a writer and I guess I don't know if you call him a social critic or whatever.
Well, hold on, but you got to set this up first. Like, what are we doing here? So I guess this is kind of prompted by me wanting to kind of know your take on what the difference between populism and socialism, right? Because I feel like it kind of overlaps, but I'm not really sure.
Let's start with that. Let's start with that. Populism, I mean, they can overlap, but there's a lot of isms out there, right? Capitalism, communism, populism, socialism, et cetera, et cetera. As far as I'm concerned, socialism is a political program of a form. It can be a form of government where the state plays an active role in ensuring economic justice. So examples of that would be like Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro, or it could also be, to some extent, Germany under Merkel, in the sense that the state plays some role in guaranteeing certain rights like healthcare, education, to a more or lesser extent. So you can have some countries that are extremely socialist, where the state basically guarantees everything, maybe to the exclusion of private institutions. And then there's the other along the continuum. There's also states like Germany where you have a private public coexistence, right? So you can have both existing. But basically, socialism, I mean, the origin of that probably comes from out of the 19th century, out of the workers' movements and the revolutions, from originally from the French Revolution, but basically 1848, when you had this upheaval in Germany and France, and there was resurgent nationalism, but there was also this idea that the common people have certain rights, and I think the theories of like Marx came out of that atmosphere, and the idea of socialism from a Marxist perspective is that that's on the continuum from capitalism, from feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism. From a Marxist perspective, it's a very definite progression based kind of on the idea that Hegel, the German philosopher, had this idea of that there was an inexorable movement in history of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And then Marx said, well, we have to apply that to capitalism, that there's actually laws that govern history in the same way that physical laws govern the material world. And whether or not you agree with that, that's what Marx was purporting. But socialism has a much broader meaning than just the Marxist interpretation. It could also just mean like a strong state role in ensuring social justice and kind of to temper capitalism, right? Because capitalism itself is ultimately going to result in these extremes of poverty and wealth and unbalanced power and injustice ultimately. So that's what socialism is. Now, populism is the idea that the people, the populace in Latin, that's where the word comes from, have an inherent common sense, I would say, and rights that should be expressed politically, and that's what populism is. And a lot of times when the elites get too concentrated and you get too much focus on on a wealthy, supposedly, expert, quote unquote, elite making decisions that end up being bad decisions, then a lot of times populism is a reaction to that. And populism in this country, we have a rich tradition of that, to start in actually the 1890s, when there was actually a party called the People's Party that was started to counter the elites who told the farmers and everything that it's just, if you're failing, it's just too bad. We can't really do anything about that, but that's just your problem. And so that there was this whole movement with William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president on the Democratic ticket in 1896 as a populist. And a parallel kind of is like Trump with the Republicans. The Democrats weren't that excited about William Jennings Bryan, but they kind of said, okay, we'll let him run as our candidate this time because he was so popular. He was he was like 36 years old. He was from Nebraska, one-term representative, but a very eloquent, forceful speaker who articulated the voice of farmers and workers who felt like they were being exploited. And there was kind of this anti-elitism. And long story short, of course, they lost to William McKinley, the Republican, in 1896, who was like the ultimate capitalist candidate, and populism kind of died down by the end of the 1890s. But as a result of that populist movement, that kind of transmogrified into the progressive movement, and you had things such as the income tax, working laws governing working conditions, women's suffrage. So a lot of these things that came out of the early decades of the 20th century had their roots in populism.
You think it was just a raising of awareness of government can do these things for us from that movement?
Right. Yeah. And I'm reading Thomas Frank's book now, The People Know, N-O, not K-N-O-W, A History of Anti-Populism, is that that attacks on populism from the 1890s really parallel almost exactly the attacks on populism now. That the claim is that populism is right-wing, nationalistic, is run by demagogues like Trump, and this is a dangerous trend. And the people common people can't make the decisions. We need to have experts making the decisions, and people, who are, we need to have the wealthy elite, Jeff Bezos's and the Elon Musk's of the world, as well as the experts in the bureaucracy in Washington making decisions. And this was the idea, like in the early 60s, there was the Pentagon, you had McNamara, and there were people writing at the time saying this, isn't this great? We have these experts making decisions. And of course it led to the Vietnam War, and it led to, we had these decisions about invading Iraq that ended up being a disaster. So there is no, the so-called expert elite ends up making really bad decisions sometimes, but they will attack the populace as being kind of the uncouth, uneducated hordes who are just looking for handouts. And some of the attacks on Bernie Sanders' program, I
just want to say real quick. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
that's all right.
And that can kind of spiral, right? Because the fact that they view them so much as uneducated hordes shows their elitism, which then feeds into the populists' distrust,
right,
and want to break from.
And the classic case is Hillary calling them deplorables, right?
Exactly.
So it's like, these people they're not really qualified to make decisions. And basically, if you fail, that's just too bad. And it's interesting, the Democratic Party went from being the party of slavery in the post-Civil War period to the party of Roosevelt, which was the progressive party of workers, right, and farmers. And then it has become the party of the top 10%, whereas and this is to paraphrase Thomas Frank again, they become the party of the top 10%, whereas Republicans are the party of the top 1%, or maybe the 0.1%. The Democrats represent elites, maybe a slightly broader swath of elites, but still represent elites and basically aren't doing anything for people on the bottom, so Trump can do some things. He's not a populist.
I don't know though. Cenk Uygur is telling me he's going to push Biden to the left, no matter what.
All right, hold on, Steve, because he's been going on tangents here. Right?
Yeah, sorry.
So, all right. So, would you say that so populism is an ideology, right? And it can, I guess, the ultimate manifestation of that in government wise would be socialism, right?
Yes, I mean, the ultimate manifestation would be communism, like you had in I mean, and people would argue with that, but I would say, like, a workers' farmers state
gives the government the control, right? Or is that the socialism that gives the government the control?
Well, in the idea in communism is that you have a dictatorship of the proletariat, which is the working class. So the working class is, in theory, is dominating the government. So there's the government of the workers. You have these workers' councils. In Russia, they were called Soviets. They were the workers' councils. So the idea is that every factory you had workers' councils making decisions about how to run the factory, who to hire, and the result was disastrous because it was the opposite extreme. You had people who really didn't know anything.
Wouldn't that be kind of the equivalent of like a workers' co-op, a worker co-op,
right?
That's being pushed,
right?
now?
Right. And having, like in Germany, you have workers, you have employees on the boards of corporations as required. So that's kind of moving in that direction. Whereas in this country, you don't have that.
I'm sorry, do you want to say, but a workers' co-op would be different in that workers' co-op, you're talking about the workers essentially owning the factory, right?
They have a stake, yes. They have
a financial stake. So they want to see it run correctly. So they might do something. They want to see it profit. So they might bring in outside experts to make it work. Whereas you're talking in the Soviet situation, these people have to have a job. They have a job and they have a stake in running the factory, but they don't have any differing financial stake in whether or not that factory churns out 100,000 widgets a year or 10,000 widgets a year, right? So it's different when you're removing a financial incentive, which can make all the difference, right?
Right, and under the Soviet system, they didn't have financial incentives. It was based on.
That's what I'm saying.
You did kind of like they had people you could win if you won the Stalin Prize under Stalin. You got like 10,000 rubles or something, which is like not that much money. But basically, it was like they gave out medals left and right, right? So like you got. You got Soviet Hero of Labor if you beat the quota on coal mining or something like that. So it was based on incentives, non-monetary incentives to a large degree. But yeah, I mean, what form does that take? I don't know. It's not always clear cut because, like, Richard Wolff, right? The NYU Marxist, probably the preeminent Marxist economist today, and he's all
Isn't
over
he
YouTube.
a professor emeritus at Harvard or something?
Yeah, I don't know.
Pretty sure he lives here in Massachusetts.
I thought he was in, and I'm not sure where he is, but he's like, he's another, from that New York Jewish Brooklyn tradition, like a Bernie Sanders, and he really is a Marxist, and he's an interesting character, but he talks about how he had setting up workers councils or workers cooperatives, but other than that, it's not really, how do you actually get there?
Well, actually, it's funny because that you mentioned him, because I actually just saw something that he put out. He has a show called Economic Update, and I don't always tune into what he's putting out, but the fact that he interviewed someone who is a friend of his from Cuba, and she was talking about how, if I'm not mistaken, she said that I think 70% of like businesses are actually worker co-ops in Cuba. It's actually gotten to the point where they have tried to transition more of the power to, and Cuba is a communist country. And for me, I feel something personal because of the fact that my mom was Cuban. And so, I have very mixed feelings about Cuba and about Fidel Castro and all that, because obviously my family fled from Cuba, so it's very difficult to see that, there are positive things that are going on there when the only narrative that you hear coming from anyone that's living in Miami or that has left Cuba is that Cuba is like the worst place in the world,
Yeah. Well, it's changed since in the post-Castro era or the post
yeah, since
Fidel
his
era.
brother,
Under Raul, there was
Yeah.
a lot more opening up. So they have a lot of small, restaurants can be owned privately now, or these small shops that depend on the tourist trade. And
well, the majority of the co-ops that they have is actually land, and what they do is that like, I guess for every she didn't talk about this, but I had actually seen like another documentary about this previously, where they I guess for like every community they have a group of people that the government gives them a loan essentially so that they can have a worker co-op, right? And they can, and so they grow the food that is necessary for the community, and it's free. The community doesn't have to pay for anything. This is all a part of it.
Right.
And the way that they learn, obviously, how to grow it's more sustainable. It's something. It's like the whole, teach a man to fish metaphor, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, we have no populism. We're like the most unpopulous populist country in the world, I think. I mean, maybe there's another country like that's not, but I mean, we have, I mean, case example is like the opinion of people is not reflected in legislation, right? So like, even most Republicans support gun control, right? Or even most Republicans support some kind of Medicare for all, but it's and a vast majority of people support that, but it's not reflected in the government. So we don't have any populist expression in government, so it's gotten worse over time. So that's why we need some kind of populism. And Bernie Sanders, that whole movement was just, I mean, they took the wind out of their sails totally, right, in the primaries, and it's just never, I mean, Biden obviously is not part of that progressive, populist.
He's the antithesis of it.
He's the antithesis of it. I mean, he'll give some lip
But that's
service
because
to
Nancy
it.
Pelosi says we don't actually want change. Remember,
That's right.
Steve, you don't want
Yeah.
change.
Yeah.
Well,
and Nancy knows best.
And you're right. And she actually, when she said we, she literally put it on the people. She literally said the people don't want change. Basically, they're happy with what they got. Yeah.
But I mean, she's the ultimate elitist with her ice cream freezer and everything.
Oh, sure.
That's the opposite side of populism is elitism. So you have elitists, especially incompetent.
Which that's what the Democratic Party, it's like synonymous with elitism now, right? Like especially the right. That is what they just bunch everybody who is on the left or a Democrat. They say, "Oh, you're an elitist," essentially.
Right, but I mean, they're like, it's like the pot calling the kettle black, because the Republicans are also, for the most part, except for there's a libertarian.
Oh, I'm talking about the base, not the Republicans in DC.
Oh, that's the Republican Party. Okay.
Yeah.
But a lot of Republicans,
talking about the base, like the people that are actually going for Trump. For them,
right.
One of the major reasons why they went for Trump the first time, it was because it was supposed to be a major, big middle finger to the establishment, to the elite, right?
Right.
So the other thing that I was thinking about this was that, okay, so I think of populism, and it made me think of essentially it's really supposed to be ultimately democracy. What really democracy is supposed to be really is that everyone has a voice, right? And obviously we think about this now because of the Electoral College, and should we abolish the Electoral College, and then the repercussions of that. But then I think to myself, first of all, we don't live in a democracy, right? And I'm talking about little d democracy, not.
And we never have.
Yeah, and we never have, exactly. But it's supposedly, even our founding fathers thought that it was not okay for the majority, because democracy is essentially like mob rule, right? It's that everybody has a say. And then it made me think about how Socrates was that we think about Athens, we think about Greece as like that is where the birthplace of democracy, right? But then Socrates, who was this our forefather of the philosophy, right? He was so against it, and it actually brought his demise, right? Because he was actually he was accused by like 500 Athenians or whatever, just regular people, and they sentenced him to death.
Right.
And so it actually, like, his argument against it was what the ironic thing was, that it actually brought his death to him.
Well, I mean, the founding fathers, you bring that up, it's a good example, because the founding fathers, I mean, to some extent they were populist, right? Because they said, of the people, whatever, we the people, right? So that's a populist sentiment. But on the other hand, they made the House of Representatives, that's a populist House branch of government of the Congress. But the Senate was, I mean, it was until like the 17th Amendment or whatever amendment it was, it was selected by the state legislatures. The people did not vote directly for the senators, and we still have the electoral college. It's almost like
the super delegates of today, right?
Yeah, but I mean, it wasn't democratic, and the Supreme Court is not democratic. So the founding fathers were very wary of pure democracy. They didn't want it, and also, like, women didn't have a vote. And if you were a
Black
slave,
people
you were
only 3/5 of a person.
Right, 3/5 of a person. So this whole, going back to the originalists, going back to the founding fathers. I mean, you have to, like, does that mean they agree with like this whole attitude that you can't trust the people? And the whole anti-populism now going on, it's like they're attacking the people. And yeah, you can have mob rule. And the classic case is like the French Revolution, where you had a popular uprising, and then you had the Jacobins take over under Robespierre, and they started beheading everybody, right? For like, and everybody, like, they would take like a merchant and they would behead the whole family and their servants and everything, and children. And it was just like horrible. So that's, if you let the mob take over, according to the anti-populists, then we're going to end up with something like that. We're going to end up with executions in Central Park, to paraphrase Chris Matthews, right?
Chris Matthews, exactly. I was going to bring him up.
Yeah. I mean,
I know, but what I think is funny, the fact that most people think that, like, what we just described as like mob rule, that is anarchy, right? When in actuality, it is democracy. It almost feels like an oxymoron.
Well, yeah, but in the French Revolution, you had these like tribunals, pronouncing a sentence in the morning, and the execution would be carried out in the afternoon. So it was not really democracy. It was kind of, and like, the parallels like Stalinism, right, where you had these show trials and people were put on trial, and basically they said, if you confess that you were an agent of fascist Germany, we'll spare your family. You'll still be executed, but we'll spare your family. So these people would confess. I mean, that wasn't democracy, but that happened.
Or was it? Because if that's what the majority of the people want, right, then.
Well, I don't think the majority of people wanted that in that system. And then
who knows?
And then Khrushchev.
I don't know. Khrushchev, people are pretty sick.
22nd
people
Party
used
Congress.
To like to watch, these executions and burnings, and I mean.
There's also just the problem
like some pretty sick stuff.
Yeah. Right. I mean, a mob is a mob democracy. I mean, a mob, when no one has individual responsibility, right? If you're all shouting, yeah, execute that person, burn that witch, etc. It's because no one person has responsibility. Everyone can just go along with whatever the exciting thing is, or whatever,
right. I think about Gaddafi.
Yeah.
That's the ultimate to me, is Gaddafi. Yeah. What they did to him, the way that they did that in public, it's like,
right. Or
that's modern time, like, people really don't think that happens today, and it does.
I think we talk about democracy, we mean some kind of organized political system where you have, one person, one vote, or you have some kind of structure, and not just, a crowd of people calling for,
right,
lock her up or whatever.
Something that causes some kind of level of responsibility rather than simply shouting out.
But then you have the argument that again, going back to like Socrates, right? That what they argued was that if you're going to have everybody voting, that they should be educated, right? You don't want just like anybody going because of the kind of stuff that can happen. And so that kind of leans into how people nowadays, I mean, first of all, most people don't even vote, unfortunately. But they're definitely, the majority of people that actually do vote are not educated. They're not making an educated decision. They're usually just following whatever the person that they trust to tell them, to tell them
I
what
think
to
that's true.
do, then that's what they do.
I mean, look at the Biden campaign ads. Like the last couple of weeks are like him hugging children, and I mean,
Yeah.
hugging children
Don't go
in a kind of respectful way, and like just these platitudes about whatever, restore integrity to our government. I mean, it's just like all BS, right? Because it's just, and it is really contemptuous of the masses. I think people, they just figure like we're not gonna address these complicated issues like foreign policy or whatever. We're just gonna, we have a few feel good images of American flag and Biden, being a nice guy, and therefore you should vote for him.
Right. And you know how Cenk Uygur says that he's going to push Biden or whatever, you're going to need to have the numbers to push him, right? And the majority of people, because they're so uninformed on what's going on, they're not going to know what to hold him accountable for. So
It's
all
not
of
gonna,
this stuff.
it's not gonna happen. It's not gonna
Right.
happen.
That's what I'm saying. That,
Yeah,
that he's not going to be held to account.
You'll get a $15 minimum wage, and that's about it.
Yeah.
You
That's
think so?
interesting. The idea of like how many hours do you have to dedicate in order to be a successful participant in our democracy or our our government. It seems like in order to understand enough to really be able to make a judgment on who to vote for president or this or that, the bar is kind of high, right? You have to know a lot.
Yeah. On the other hand, you have like people know that they want health care, right? And they know the system we have now is totally fucked up.
And they know that neither
you're right
one of
about
those
that.
candidates is going to give them that health care.
Yeah,
right.
So
I mean,
so you're right. That's right. So that's probably the best way for the average person out there. Again, I don't want to put myself as elitist. I just happen to be stupid and have time to look at this stuff, I guess. But the average person that doesn't have a bunch of time to look at this, if you simply pick, okay, what's the most important thing to me right now? We on the domestic side, we need healthcare. On the international side, don't get into wars. You should be able to get a gut read on people for those and just look at records and get a feel for that. That's probably the most successful way people can.
I mean, look at the Our Revolution movement got so much support, and then it was just quashed.
Right.
Because Bernie would have won in 2016 if he had run. I'm pretty sure. I mean, because he was very, very popular. His movement was very, very popular because it was a populist movement.
We don't know how he would have done with the Electoral College because.
Well, look at this. He won in Michigan in the primary overwhelmingly against Hillary Clinton in 2016. So I mean,
but that's not the Electoral College, though.
It's not, but the Electoral College is decided in those upper Midwest states a lot of times because you know which way the South is going to go and you know which way the coasts are going to go. But a lot of times those swing states are Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan. Those.
But technically, the Electoral College, or at least not in all states, they don't have to vote the way that their population votes. Some of the states, yes, you are required to, but not all of them. Well, so that's what I'm saying, that it's like, it really doesn't matter.
Put it this way, he had a fighting chance, right? I mean,
for sure. Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, the system is stacked against democracy, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not fair. Okay, just to tie up this discussion of socialism versus populism, I would say socialism is a form of government, whereas populism is a political phenomenon or a movement, or it can be you can have right-wing populism, from a leader, or you can have a mass party, a mass movement on the ground, such as the Farmers Alliance of the 1890s, that's calling for a certain policy that's populism. Or there could be a party expression of that, like the People's Party or Movement for a People's Party. Those are populist trends but populism is not, you can't say like, populism is not a form of government. Socialism is, and socialism tends to be more populist than some other forms of government, I would say. So that to me that's the difference between them. And they can overlap. I mean, you can have a populist socialist like Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela, right? And you can have a populist, you can have, Hitler with a National Socialist German Workers' Party, right? Which is the name. But I mean, it was socialist in the sense that it was a strong state allied with industry trying to implement, racial policies and nationalist policies. So to that extent, it was socialist. But I think usually you think of socialist as being creating more justice for the people as a whole, not just, the select racial group or whatever.
But see, that's what your interpretation of what I was trying to say is that it always seems as though there's this link between socialism and populism. And so it almost makes it so that it's like it's very hard to delineate what the difference is between the two. Because it seems like they have the same objective, right?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think more in the Marxist sense of socialism as being a form of government that tries to redistribute wealth to some extent, or at least temper the extremes of capitalism, whether it's Christian socialism or democratic socialism or pure socialism. That's how I see it. So that is my interpretation. So maybe we'll leave it there.
All right.
One thing I had was, this, while we're on the subject of elections, is, obviously people think, oh, I'm frustrated with no health care, or I'm frustrated with this or that. So therefore I'm gonna go vote for this candidate because they support that. Or maybe they go the next stage and they say, well, I'm gonna get involved with a political party and volunteer and work in a campaign, and because this candidate supports what I want. So that's like believing that elections are going to actually have an effect. So you think because I'm electing my candidate, they're going to vote for my policy in Congress, and somehow this policy will become the law of the land, right? But it hasn't worked that way for the last at least 40 years. So one of the things that I came across in that article I shared with you, and I'll share the screen here. This is an Australian socialist online journal that I came across. And this article was pretty good because it's, and I don't know much about this Eleanor Morley who wrote the article. She's written a couple of things about the.
Oh, she works with Lee Camp.
She works with what?
Lee Camp.
Oh, Lee Camp. Okay. I didn't know that. So anyways, she's written some things on the Minsk protests in Belarus. But this piece was kind of interesting. And her contention is that the change comes about through struggle, not elections. So for instance, she gives the example of the, she doesn't give the example, but I give the example of the populist movement in the 1890s, which even though they didn't win, they won some local elections and they won some governorships. They never won the White House, but they still were successful in pushing the Democratic Party to or just in general, pushing through some of these policies like the income tax, getting off the gold standard ultimately, and women's suffrage. So they had an effect. And also she contends, for instance, in the 30s that Roosevelt was elected in 32 and reelected in 36. But it was the fact that there were these strikes going around the country in 1934 where workers were really successful in closing down whole cities, like in Minneapolis and Toledo and San Francisco. And this really scared the ruling elites, and that pushed FDR to implement a lot of his policies, which they call the Second New Deal, which was more radical than the First New Deal, like Social Security and these policies.
So I agree with that. I agree that the idea that movements push actual change more than elections. I mean, it's become kind of ridiculous to the point that we know that whatever the platform the party adopts is basically meaningless. That, you know, it's very little chance that they're going to actually do anything from that. So the modern equivalent would be like, is the protests going on across the country going to actually result in any legislation or any meaningful change? I mean, that's the modern equivalent.
Well,
right?
she says there's two things. Number one, it can result in change if there's enough people, and it scares the elites. For instance, in the 1890s or the first years of the 20th century, I'm not sure which, but you had this group called Coxey's Army, Coxey, that marched on Washington. This was like disgruntled farmers from around the country who just showed up, you know, to push this populist platform. And if you had an equivalent type of thing today, you know, with 1 million out of work, hungry people, let's say, you know, 6 months from now, marching on Washington, that could have an influence on politicians, number one. And number two, if nothing else, it creates, it changes the consciousness of the participants. So the participants become politically engaged. They're more likely to vote. They're more likely to volunteer with a campaign or a party than they would be otherwise. So these movements have a dual purpose. One is, you know, increasing consciousness of the participants as well as trying to influence policy changes, right?
So the modern equivalents, right? So when Trump got elected, there was all sorts of protests, you know, for, you know, pro science and so forth. You know, did that actually affect any change? And are the current protests likely to affect any change? I think it, just because politicians being who they are, they will pander to people that, you know, the squeaky wheel, if something's going on like that. And they certainly, you know, fear that for the loss of their job if they don't make the appearance of trying to do something. But they just seem to be able to get away right now with saying, you know, orange man bad, and COVID,
that's the point.
COVID's killing us, and it's all Trump's fault.
So Eleanor Morley in this article is saying basically that the elections are a distraction. I mean, I wouldn't go that far. I think elections are important, but she would say that she calls it electoralism. I would call it electionalism, I think is a more accurate term. But the idea is that people get fixated on, you know, Biden versus Orange Man. And it's like the whole Black Lives Matter, which was huge a few months ago, now has been eclipsed by the drama of, you know, the game show of the election, and that's distracted people from trying to implement some of the policies of like police reform and all this stuff that we talked about a few months ago.
Well, and the funny thing is, what's meaningfully come out of this Black Lives Matter protest is both candidates talking up about support for the police, and they're arguing over who is more into funding the police, so
or fracking or something, right?
Or fracking or something. So, you know, I guess we're just broken. I don't know.
Well, so it ultimately comes down to, as far as, I mean, okay, one thing, these protests, they increase consciousness. If you participate in a campaign or a protest, you're going to become more engaged, right? But as far as what influence do you really have over the politicians, over the elite? Ultimately comes, you know, from a Marxist perspective, you can withhold your labor. So if you go on strike and don't work, you know, at least in the industrial world of 100 years ago, that was a real threat to, or even like under Roosevelt, that was in the 30s, that was a threat of, you know, if you didn't work, the country wasn't able to produce its basic gross domestic product or whatever it is. They wouldn't be able to do that. And the other side of that is soldiers refused to fight, which is what happened in the World War I with the Russian, you know, after the Tsar fell in February of 1917. This is before the October Revolution. There was actually a non-communist revolution for like 6 months before that under Kerensky, and the soldiers, you know, refused to fight. So that also led to the collapse of that regime. And then in Vietnam, the parallel, which is described in this particular article, the soldiers there, you know, they were aware of what was going on with the anti-war movement at home, and they were getting high all the time, and they were totally disillusioned, and not buying into the whole domino theory, and we have to defeat the communists. And they knew that the South Vietnamese government was totally corrupt. It was just a puppet regime. And so they lost their interest in doing that. And so that's another lever that can be brought on the ruling power. So if you stop fighting for them and you stop producing for them as workers, then that's a threat. Now, I would argue that that's changing ultimately with increasing automation, not only in production, but in AI and warfare, that's the ultimate goal of the elites, is not have to depend on people at all, because machines don't go and strike. But
that's true.
But ultimately, when it comes down to it, that's a lot scarier to the elites than an election, because the elections, they pretty much have it under control. I mean, they have a system with Republicans and Republicans light under the Democrats, basically, that it's twiddle-dum and twiddle-dee. No matter which party is in control, they're not really going to be threatened. They will be threatened
they have things pretty well. Yeah, they have things pretty well locked down since Ross Perot. They locked down the kicked the woman voter, was it League of Women Voters from organizing the debate. So now they basically have total control of the whole process.
Right.
And now, the fact that people are such saps and will put up with the Democrats just rigging like every primary, apparently, here we'll just, I think they would get more respect. They would actually have less ill will if they actually simply said, from now on, we're just going to select the candidate, rather than have this fake primary that then they have to rig. It's just like, why don't they just say, we know best, and we're going to work in your interest, and we're going to pick a candidate? Then you wouldn't have all these people that are just like so disgusted with them because they just obviously rigged the primary, Sorry, off on a tangent.
No, they got to maintain the facade, right? The facade of
and they're trying to figure out how to do that. I think they're trying to figure out how to actually control the primary without it being quite so obvious next time,
But I mean, what levers can people pull to actually change the system besides elections? It seems like, you pull the lever when you vote, I guess, so to speak. But like, can we, are we beyond the time when people can go and strike, have a mass strike, a mass work stoppage, or we have a volunteer army, so they're not really going to refuse to. When you had draft, right, it was different, right? But like,
that's right.
So how do you really put pressure on the elite to push for change? I don't know. I don't know if you guys have any ideas how you would do that. I mean, do we just keep working on elections? Is that the way to go?
Yeah, I mean,
putting the question out there.
The only hope I have right now, I'm clinging to it, that Massachusetts, we have the ranked choice vote. I'm just kind of hoping that but you're talking such a slow process before that would move across the country, and then people would have to demand that also is in place for national elections before it really is going to make a big difference, and we can get third parties involved, and we're doomed before that would actually come across anyway. So I don't have any answers.
I mean, do we just educate people, Daisy? Do you think that? I mean, do we just educate people? Is that what
I don't have any answers either. The problem is that we're so beaten down, and we were kind of talking about this in our pre-show chat the other day, how we're getting to the point where we as a species essentially, well, there are obviously human beings that live in like the Amazon, and they're able to take care of themselves, but for the most part we are serfs, like we have to kneel to the government because we need to suck off that teat. We cannot live on our own. Like we were talking about the other day, if something were to happen, if some sort of emergency were to happen, the majority of people, what do? They're going to look to their government to make sure that the government has some sort of plan in place, right? And the expectation is that, like, also like what we were talking about, that if you're paying taxes to live here, you pay these taxes with some sort of expectation, right? Most people think that it's their taxes that are paying for things, when in actuality that's not how money works. Money is created and then they just tax it, like all the money that they create, then they just tax us on that money, so that way kind of there is no like inflation and all this kind of stuff. And but the price that you pay for living here is that you, like I said, you have this expectation of what government will do. And we've gotten to the point where we've become so complacent, especially here in the Western world, when there's so many other parts of the world, especially where that they are having to pay the price for our luxury, for our complacency, for our convenience. I think about, you know, these kids in like the Congo. I think I just saw something where there's I think it's like 40,000 kids are being used to mine for cobalt and, you know, and all of these different minerals and shit that goes into our electronics, you know. And we sit here, and the majority of us unfortunately sit here and complain about, you know, our government not doing shit. But you know, this is what our government is doing. That's the problem, is that because we're not educating ourselves on what our government is actually doing. First of all, you can't hold them to account if you don't know what they're doing, right? And because of the fact that we don't hold them to account, and because we are so uneducated, the majority of us are so uneducated, they feel like, well, I mean, if they're not going to ask anything of us, then we're not going to do anything for them. You know, that's just what it comes down to. So that's why these elections, or even a lot of these movements, they feel kind of futile. If you really think about the fact that, think about this year, how many they're still now in Philadelphia, you know, they're having to call in the National Guard because of all the riots and like looting and all this kind of stuff that's going on, because of another death that was at the hands of a police officer. And you know, no matter what the story is, the fact that all year we've been having to deal with all of these things, and the Democrats' answer to that is to give you Biden, the author of the 1994 crime bill, and cut Mala. Okay, like that is.
Yeah.
They're not listening. They're not listening. Yeah. And so what are we supposed to do?
And Biden's response to Rodney King was to write a policeman's bill of rights or something like that. It's like,
but then if you think about it,
yeah.
What Biden, how many times has he told people, then go vote for Trump? Or, you know, like, he's so flippant about it. He doesn't care. Just like all of them, they don't care, because they think, just like Thomas Frank, even though, like, I watched the interview that he did with Massachusetts Peace Organization, which I thought was really great. But even the fact that he was saying that the whole thing is that we just have to get Trump out. It doesn't matter. Trump is the bad guy. Yeah. It's just all about getting Trump out. You know, even though Biden is, it's almost, you can say that it can almost be worse because of what we've been talking about, that people just want things to go back to normal. They want to be able to go back to sleep. They want to be able to go to brunch.
I was going to say, that's the right word. They want to go back to sleep. You don't want to worry about, okay, those cages will still be there in the border, but we won't worry.
Who built the cages? But exactly like what Trump said. Who built the cages?
Yeah, we won't worry about them anymore, right? Yeah, we won't worry about them anymore. They can do more you know, attacks on Native Americans. What am I talking about there?
Standing Rock.
Yeah, Standing Rocks and all that. And people will, again, it'll be under the wire. They just won't care. You know, any kind of peace movement can stay asleep. Despite what Biden's likely to do.
And even you have like Extinction Rebellion, and you have the Sunshine Movement, all of these environmental movements that are all behind Biden, and oh my God, and all this. Right. When he has come out and said that he is not for fracking, right? Again, it's like they spit in your face constantly. What you are begging from them, they just like they couldn't care less about what it is that you want. This is anti-populism. I feel like that's what this is, you know.
I mean, the Democrats really get their act together when they're trying to put down, you know, the left or progressives or whatever, or populists, whatever you want to call it. You know, they're not very effective at fighting against Republicans. You know, they want to get along. In fact, they're putting, you know, Biden's going to put a bunch of Republicans in his cabinet. But like, you know, when it comes to like trying to quash any kind of you know, upsurge among the Democrats, like, you know, our revolution or whatever, then they just, you know, they'll do whatever it takes to, like, you know, voter fraud or whatever. Like, you look at what was the state where they had, like Iowa, where they had that fiasco with the software and everything.
With the app.
I mean, they'll just, or they'll co-opt, you know, Bernie Sanders is like, you know, an old guy who had a heart condition, and they're just gonna like, they'll
Look
buy him out. And
look at the convention. They had like a couple of Republicans speak, but they couldn't have Tulsi speak, who won several. I mean, it's just like in your face.
I mean, even AOC, they gave her like a minute, and she
she was under. It had to be videotaped.
Far from super progressive.
It had to be videotaped and pre-review and review beforehand, right?
But then again, you have somebody like Tulsi. If you really look at what they did to her during this primary, you have someone who she is the ultimate candidate of America, right? Like that's who you think about, a vet, someone who I mean, she's nice to look at, you know what I'm saying? Like she's not like these old ass people. She's a really down to earth person. The way that she talks to people, she doesn't talk down to people. She really interacts, and I feel she was a good representative for her state. But look at how they treated her, and look at how, more so than how they treated her, look at how the public, there was very few people that actually stood up for her. Okay, like this whole, anti-bullying type of, environment that we have, and all this all went to anti-feminism, or the whole feminist thing that it's. Just because she's a woman, like no one came to her defense.
And it's really,
no one cared.
And it comes down to really basic, like high school peer pressure kind of stuff. Like, I'm going to be a good team player. The team is against Tulsi because why? I don't know why,
Which again goes back to democracy. Remember the mob rule thing.
It is. They weaponize that mob rule and that that peer pressure and that high school mean girl bullshit really effectively.
Even I mean, I was so blown away when I watched Glenn Greenwald on Joe Rogan, right? He did like 3 hours. It was a really good interview, but they actually talked about how Barry Weiss had gone. They were talking about like the consensus of type of information or whatever, and how these people, it's not what he actually pretty much carried water for Barry Weiss. Barry Weiss. He said that it was just like, she got nervous. It's not that she didn't actually feel these things for Tulsi, or that this is what she was fed as the acceptable information, or this is what we think of Tulsi, that she's an Assad toady, like you don't even need to know what that means, but she's that. But he actually said that it's just that she got nervous and she couldn't like explain herself properly or
Glenn
something. Yes, Glenn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I was like, are you fucking kidding me,
Right.
Glenn? Like, seriously, you just fucking left The Intercept because of all of the shenanigans that go on with the censorship and how it's all a propaganda machine, essentially. And you go and you carry water for Barry Weiss. I was really blown away by that. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make excuses for him. I think maybe he, feels some, positive energy for her for doing what she did when she left the New York Times. But he's supposed to be a truth teller, and he ought to say that, no, at that time, man, she was way off base, and she was showing that the default position is attacking Tulsi, even if you don't know what you're talking about. That's what she was being fed, and it really is exactly the kind of thing she talked against. How there's this mindset at the New York Times in the newsroom that we're going to tell you what you need to, what propaganda you need to feed the public. And, but she couldn't break out of it at that time. It would have been interesting if when she broke out and wrote that letter, if she'd actually said, yeah, and my bad take on Tulsi was a result of that, but crazy stuff.
That's giving her too much benefit of the doubt, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
I mean, how can you have that much disdain for somebody that you don't even really know anything about,
Exactly.
I mean, Glenn Greenwald, I mean, I think he's probably a difficult person to deal with on a one-to-one level. I would just imagine, I don't live with him, but I still respect him because I'm not going to cancel him because of one thing.
Oh, for sure. No, I didn't say that I would cancel him. I'm just saying that I was really taken aback when I heard this. I was like, wow.
Yeah, I'd like to watch the interview to get the full.
Yeah, that happened towards the end, just so you know.
Okay.
I think it's time for legislation.
All right. So for this week's legislative week in review, I came across this bill that is HR 13, and it's called Commitment to American Security Act. So that is what kind of pulled my attention to this, because that just sounded very vague, and it sounded, I don't know, kind of important. American Security Act, whenever they have any kind of acts like this, it's always eerie, right? And so for information, it was introduced by Mike Rogers on October 27th of this year. So far, it's just been introduced to 7 committees. So we have a Homeland Security Committee, committees on the Judiciary, Ways and Means, which we know is Steve's favorite.
Right.
The Foreign Affairs Committee, the Oversight and Reform, Energy and Commerce. So it obviously it spans a broad sort of compendium of organizations here. Obviously, if it has so many different committees that it has to present to, right? And I think that if it goes to the Ways and Means Committee, like it's pretty serious when it gets to that point. As far as co-sponsors, it's got 5 co-sponsors. Nobody really that I thought was anything too crazy. But I did want to check out the text for it, right? And so I was able to pull up the text. It's right here on congress.gov. And the first part of it says it talks about enactments, right? And so I almost feel like this is some sort of maybe like a summary type of bill, which I don't, maybe it's like to put this into the record of what part of certain bills have been enacted. I really am not sure, because
well, he's running for re-election, right? So I mean, is he challenged? I mean, I doubt he's challenged in his district in Alabama, but it may just be a posturing for the election, right? It may be a meaningless bill. Right.
So, as you can see here, the Justice Act, that has to do with, police reforms that were brought about after the George Floyd murder. But then the second part here, it talks about protecting the homeland. And it's just, as you can see here, it's just every single line just says a bill to authorize certain authorities of the Department of Homeland Security and for other purposes of the 116th Congress as introduced in the House of Representatives. It's just, and cybersecurity, the same thing, right? And then additional security measures. And again, the same thing. And so I just thought that was kind of weird. So I went and I looked up HR 8309.
Right.
All right. So then here again, introduced by Mike Rogers. So this is the other part. The other bill is saying that these were enacted, that's what I'm saying. It's like super weird how this bill, maybe that's how it works, is that you have to have like a buffer type of bill but that I know of, I haven't seen anything like this. And so this one also introduced this year, September 17th. It's just been introduced, and so that's why I thought it was kind of weird, the other one saying that it's been enacted. It's been referred to all the same committees, and it's got 13 co-sponsors, which, I mean, again, I don't really see anything from here. No, but the only one that really stood out to me was Dan Crenshaw, and I don't really know his politics. Do you guys know anything? I know he's the dude with the patch.
Yeah, what did he recently? He recently
had he was something about him.
He recently had some posts on Twitter that was spot on.
I know that when the whole Unity 2020 thing was brought about, they were talking about having Tulsi and Crenshaw on there.
I know what he recently did that I thought was great, was he basically said, I know there's no real liberals left when nobody said anything about when the big tech was on Capitol Hill, like nobody complained anything about censorship going on. None of the left complained at all about any of the censorship. And he called that out, which I thought was pretty great.
Yeah, I've heard mixed things about him. So I'm not really sure. Again, I don't really know about his politics, but
Yeah, he and Tulsi were the ones that won the nomination for the unity.
Right.
Ticket, yeah.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So then I wanted to see what the text was, if it's talking about the different sections of this text, right? And this was introduced again back in September.
Mhm.
So you would think the other one has text. It was just introduced October 27th, and this one there's no text.
Wow.
And so I went and I looked. This is the representative, right? So it's Mike Rogers. I went on his site to see if there was, because normally they'll put out some sort of like press release or something. And I went to the press releases and he doesn't have anything from like, I think July was the last thing that he had up. God, what? Ugh, his site is a mess. Look at this thing. Jeez. Media. Here we go. Press releases. Yeah, you're gonna see there's like nothing here. So yeah, July 9th, 2020. That's the last time that he's running for re-election. So, and this is his official page. So I'm not really sure what's up with that. Okay, so then I went to GovTrack to see if maybe they had anything, and no, not available yet, right? And their source is congress.gov. And I even went to this bill sponsor here, and the text, it doesn't have anything either, right?
I mean, it's not going to pass, right? Because I mean, the House is controlled by Democrats, and this is all Republicans. So I mean, even if it's whatever it is, it's probably not going to pass, I would say. But I mean, I'm still curious.
But honestly, this almost feels like an appropriations type of bill.
Right.
That's, I don't know. Those bills are a little bit different. It doesn't.
Well, so to authorize authorities, whatever that means.
Right. That's what I'm saying. It's so vague. And the fact that there's no legislation, why wouldn't there be any sort of legislation talking about authorities given to the Department of Homeland Security? I don't know. I thought that was kind of a big deal.
So it's a big blank check to the deep state that will be filled in once Biden's elected, you think?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just think that it's super weird. Obviously, I think that Trump is going to win, but I mean, yeah, if Biden wins, then they'll definitely not even have to put out any sort of text.
Right.
But I was also reading another piece of legislation that had to do with intelligence. So it had to do with the appropriations or the fiscal year 2021. Yep. And it is kind of detailed about all this stuff. And so that's why I was like, why is it that they would put out this sort of information? But maybe it was because it was pretty bland. There was nothing really in there that I saw that really caught my eye but maybe with this Department of Homeland Security stuff, it's a little different. I don't know. I think that's something I'm definitely going to keep my eye on it because
good idea.
You having blank authorities like that definitely needs to be watched.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's kind of redundant because if you're an authority, you already are authorized. I mean, they're from the same word, the same root. So like, it's like, I don't understand how you authorize authorities, because if they're an authority, they're already authorized.
Well, but I also want to, if I'm not mistaken, DHS was created after 9/11, right?
Yeah, right. And they shuffled the agency, like FBI is part of, isn't it part? I don't know how it works, but they reshuffled things like the TSA and all that stuff is part of DHS.
Right.
Yeah. So they right.
Right. So that's again, we definitely need to be keeping an eye on that.
I mean, the whole homeland, language is redolent of the Third Reich, of the homeland. That was that's a fascist.
Oh, really?
Term. Oh, yeah. And in fact, I think it was who was the woman who wrote the book talking about I can't remember her name right now, but I saw her on Democracy Now! This is like 15 years ago, talking about the term homeland is a new. It was like the language was a definite shift, because we never used that language before of homeland and everything. It's a very much well, it's used in Russia too. You know, they had this concept of Rodina, which is the homeland,
or like Mother Russia, right?
Yeah, Mother Russia, and Germany had Nazi Germany had you know, Die Heimat, which was the homeland, from the same root, Heim, you know, home, and it was just like. And she, it's on the tip of my tongue. She made noted that this was a new shift in language. So it's definitely a quasi-fascist term, the homeland, because it implies that, you know, the rest of the world is out there, it's foreign, and this is the homeland. We're protecting the homeland. So we're no longer so much a nation of immigrants, a melting pot, but we're like protecting, you know, our turf against the evil hordes in the rest of the world. And it just changes the perspective.
Which just needs some more tribalism.
Us against them, tribalism, right? Yeah, and us against them kind of thing, sure.
Yep. So this next piece of legislation was a bill that I thought was just, it really blew me away when I read this, okay? Mostly because of who introduced this. So this is a bill introduced by Adam Schiff. It's HR 8641 to protect journalists and other members of the press from gross violations of internationally recognized human rights and for other purposes. Adam Schiff.
Okay, so what is he really targeting?
Right, who is this targeting?
Yeah, what is this really doing?
Yeah. So this was introduced on the 20th of October. It's been referred to these committees. It's got 16 co-sponsors. Jim McGovern, he seems to be all over all of this stuff, huh?
And they're all Democrats? They're all Democrats, right?
Yeah, I believe so. And then Barbara Lee, and then no one else really stands out to me here. Yeah, so then again, I always like to look at the text, right? And oddly enough, there's no text. Of course not, right? So what do? Then I go check out their pages, because normally, like I said, they have some sort of press release or something. So this is Adam Schiff. Schiff for brains is what I like to call him.
I call him Schiffless.
He is famously known for being a massive Russiagator.
And just get and the one to most be able to get away with any kind of lie that he had, you know, he said he had in the bag irrefutable proof of all this stuff, and it just turned out no, it was completely fabricating. It's unbelievable. Right. I mean, the lack of the Democrats self-policing even the very worst of their liars is amazing.
And the fact that they have yet to be held to account to have to apologize for for the division that they have brought in this country,
and the escalated Cold War and danger to everyone on the entire planet.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. All right. So then on his page, I went and I saw that he has the legislation right here, right? And so I click on here. And let's see. Oh, page not found. Of course not. But I was able to find a press release, and I found some levity in this, okay? And so I want to share this with you. So Schiff introduces legislation to protect journalists from human rights abuses. Jamal Khashoggi Press Freedom Accountability Act would levy targeted sanctions, restrict foreign aid, and bolster reporting on human rights abuses committed against journalists. Today, Representative Adam Schiff, now again, this was on the 20th of October, introduced the Jamal Khashoggi Press Freedom Accountability Act to ensure that the United States holds accountable those who commit extrajudicial killings and other gross violations of human rights against journalists. Oh, the United States is going to hold them accountable, all right? This legislation, meanwhile, do we sell arms to Saudi Arabia? Yeah. Oh,
I,
The whole war that's going on in Yemen, are we helping them with that? Yeah. Okay.
I'm laughing about the line 3 paragraphs down. A free and independent media is essential for a free society.
Oh, I know.
Are you joking?
Yeah, exactly. All right. So it says this legislation would prohibit U.S. foreign assistance to government entities and levy targeted sanctions against individuals that perpetrate gross human rights violations against journalists, and would require the Department of State to document incidents of online harassment and electronic surveillance of journalists in its annual human rights reports. Okay. So I'm expecting that the United States is going to sanction, obviously, Saudi Arabia, but also the UK government, right? Because they are torturing Julian Assange right now.
Right.
And definitely electronic surveillance of that definitely happened. So he was quoted as saying, this legislation, named in honor of the late Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, would build upon the Daniel Pearl Freedom of the Press Act, which was also introduced by Adam Schiff, to strengthen the United States' commitment to hold to account those who would target journalists for violence and persecution. A free and independent media is essential for a free society, and the United States must stand with journalists around the world who risk their lives to expose corruption,
Wow.
express independent and critical voices, and tell the difficult stories that must be told.
It's so bold. It's so unbelievable.
What the
Yeah.
fuck?
Yeah.
That was my only
Yeah.
reaction. I don't know how you can have
Yeah.
any other reaction if you actually know.
Yeah. It's like
what's
the
going
only
on.
question now is, is Biden, would the Biden administration, break Obama's record 9 Espionage Act uses, or how much more would he attack whistleblowers, or could he attack whistleblowers and journalists than Obama? Right? Horrific. I mean, it's true that Trump will say all this stuff about, it's fake news, and he's obviously not doing the right thing on Assange and Snowden and so forth. But yeah, that's where the duopoly has a say.
Right, that's the accepted narrative.
That's the accepted behavior at this point for the elite.
Well, it's very selectively applied. Obviously, I mean, it's used. It's not. It's kind of the. We can use censorship when it benefits us, then censorship is okay. And
sure, absolutely
targeted. We'll stand up for journalists if it furthers our foreign policy, geopolitical objectives, but not in general. So it's very selective. And again, this is what populism is reacting against is this obvious corruption of the supposed expert elites, right? Coming up with these policies. They're just political stances in the guise of some kind of noble defense of journalists, but it's just I mean, obviously they're not defending Assange, and they're not defending what about Michael Hastings, who died in a fiery crash in LA, going 120 miles an hour, and his brakes didn't work after he criticized General Crystal in that Rolling Stone piece. I mean, I'm just saying, was there ever an investigation of that? No.
Sure.
Right. Or what about the journalists that were I forget which publication. I don't know if it was the New York Times or the Washington Post that were killed. That was what oh my God, I am totally Manning. What Chelsea Manning exposed in those videos is how we also killed a journalist.
Right. The Reuters journalist.
There you go.
Yeah.
Reuters.
Yeah. And also we bombed the headquarters of Al Jazeera in Baghdad. Remember that? And killed an Al Jazeera journalist. And that was obviously, it was aimed at the Al Jazeera. They knew that Al Jazeera it was at a hotel, but they knew that Al Jazeera exactly what floor and what room they were in. They aimed their weapon, U.S. Army aimed their weapon at that room. So obviously that was a direct, literal attack on journalism.
Right.
Because we didn't like what they were saying.
Right.
and I don't care whether it's Pravda or People's Daily or Al Jazeera. And Al Jazeera was actually quite respected as an institution. Like there's no excuse for that.
Yeah.
Ever.
But we will never be held to account, which is that's what's so maddening about all this, that again, if we were to actually apply the laws or whatever sort of rules it is that we have decided all on our own, if we actually implemented them on ourselves, we would not exist as a country anymore. Okay, we would have just all eaten ourselves pretty much, because we would have been sanctioned to death. It would have been siege warfare inflicted on ourselves, essentially.
Right. Well, they're banking on people being apathetic and not really. They're too concerned with making ends meet and everyday concerns to really be worried about journalists or these other issues. People, everyday people, just they're banking on people not being concerned about it. And it did surface a little bit, I think, with the whole, when Bernie was pressed on Snowden, he said, I would probably pardon him or whatever. And even going that far that was really scary to the elites. I don't think, but there's never been a mass movement pushing for.
Well, and talking about Bernie, he never really talks about Assange, how he's being persecuted, but he did feel that it was okay to talk about Khashoggi, which that's why I feel that this is it's the acceptable, like this one's okay to talk about, but it's almost like the crimes that are committed, like now the whole thing that happened in France, again with Charlie Hebdo, with people being attacked, like these terrorist attacks that are supposedly happening as a result of this, and that teacher that was beheaded, from my understanding, he wasn't beheaded. It was that, he was pretty much beheaded, but he was not beheaded out in public. But still, we talk about, we're so taken aback and we cannot comprehend that sort of terrorism, but we don't want to even think about the fact that there is terrorism being committed against people at our behest. Okay, like and unknowingly, unwittingly for a lot of people, but it is happening. Like there are people that are suffering all over the world. Just because it's not in a Western country doesn't make it any less.
Right. But we benefit from it economically, and the whole capitalist system is, corporations are required to maximize profits for their maximize returns for their shareholders, right? So if you can get cheap cobalt or whatever it is from Congo, and it just happens to be exploiting kids who are mining the stuff, well, so be it, because the corporations are required to maximize their profits. So it's inherent in the whole system, the economic system, and we benefit that because we can go out and buy our cheap TV at Walmart, our HD TV, and sit and watch, MSNBC or Fox or whatever we watch, because of that system.
Right. But so going kind of back to what you were talking about earlier, and how do we kind of change things, and how you've been talking about that we need some sort of change in consciousness, it starts with holding up that mirror and seeing that ugly side. And Trump being in office kind of did that for some people, not enough people, and it kind of also highlighted Obama. Like, it's really opened a lot of people's eyes to Obama. Not everyone, obviously, but it really has shown a light on, because Trump has just continued on with and exacerbated Obama's policies. Trump would not be able to do the majority of the things that he's done, even though he really hasn't done all that much. But whatever he has been able to do has been because the infrastructure was already set by Obama. You know what I'm saying? Sure. And so in that sense, it there is that benefit, but unfortunately, not enough people, like, we really need to struggle some more, I guess.
Right.
You
Well, we
know?
get
Like, people
fixated on
really
this
need to
the
struggle,
false
unfortunately.
dichotomy between, the two parties, and thinking that like if only my party gets in power, then we're going to fix things. And these two parties aren't that far apart. Like, they're both elitist parties, and they both serve the same system. And then people have to see beyond that. But people are totally brainwashed and thinking like, we just have to get the orange guy out, which, he's horrible, but it's not going to fix it. In fact, the long-term results may actually be worse. I hate to say it, but you may have complacency as a result of a Biden victory, and things don't change that much. And then, then you're just going to kick the can down the road further, right?
Well, yeah. What will all the media that's currently just been so focused and profited off of Trump for the past 4 years, what will they do under Biden? Right? I mean, are they going to are they going to, wherever, Trump's going to go back to Mar-a-Lago and they're all going to follow him and just say, look at him, he ordered a cheeseburger or something, and report on that. I mean, they're not going to want to hold Biden to account. So I don't know what the heck they're going to do, but they're certainly not going to tell us what he's doing. They're certainly not going to want to report on any, new wars or anything like that.
I kind of think Trump will keep himself in the news, because he's all about his brand, and he doesn't want to just disappear. So I think he's going to do stuff. He'll still hold rallies, and he'll do whatever he does, even if he doesn't get reelected. So I think the media will still give him.
Well, thanks to Adam Schiff, we'll have lots of journalists around being protected,
Right.
From human rights violations and, and
real
murder.
journalists like Chuck Todd or some, going out and.
Or no, who's the other one that Jim Acosta? Oh,
yeah, right.
Jim Acosta.
Right. Anywho, well, that was interesting.
Yeah.
So if you do find what the text is, then definitely let us know, because
I have a feeling that it's going to be another one of those. It's going to surface right before it becomes enacted, essentially.
Well, it's going to be another. You need to pass the bill in order to find out what's in it.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like the Patriot Act. No one actually read it, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We'll see you
Thanks for watching.
We'll see you
Please
after
like, share,
the election.
comment, and subscribe.
All right. Take
Bye.
care.
See you next week. Bye, guys.
Bye.